The Day Humans First Walked on the Moon Part 2, July 16, 1969, the wait was over. For more than a decade, thousands of scientists, engineers, technicians, and astronauts had worked toward a single goal. Now, everything depended on one mission. Standing on Launch Complex 39A at Kennedy Space Center was the most powerful rocket the world had ever seen, the Saturn V. It stood nearly 111 meters tall, about the height of a 36-story building. It weighed more than 3,000 tons when fully fueled. Inside that giant rocket, 3 men waited quietly. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, each knew the risks, each knew there was no guarantee they would ever see Earth again, yet none of them turned back. Outside, an estimated 1 million people gathered along the beaches, highways, and parks surrounding Cape Kennedy. Some had traveled hundreds of kilometers just to witness history. Hotels were fully booked, roads were packed with cars, people carried cameras, binoculars, and radios. Around the world, more than 600 million people prepared to watch through television broadcasts. Never before had so many people shared the same moment. It wasn't just an American mission anymore, it had become humanity's mission. Chapter 1, The Countdown. Inside the spacecraft, everything was calm. The astronauts spoke little. Years of training had prepared them for this day. Every movement followed a checklist, every switch had a purpose, every second mattered. Mission Control in Houston watched hundreds of screens. Flight controllers checked thousands of readings. Fuel pressure, engine temperatures, electrical systems, communication signals, everything had to be perfect. Outside, the countdown echoed across loudspeakers. T-minus 10 minutes, the excitement grew. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Reporters spoke into microphones, photographers aimed their cameras. Then, 1 minute remaining, the launch pad fell almost silent. Everyone stared at the towering Saturn V. The astronauts couldn't see the crowds, but they knew millions of eyes were on them. Then came the final count. 10, 9, 8, the engines awakened. 7, 6, huge clouds of steam surrounded the rocket. 5, 4. The ground began to shake. 3, 2, 1, ignition. 5 mighty F-1 engines erupted beneath the Saturn V. More than 7.5 million pounds of thrust pushed against the Earth. For a brief moment, the rocket seemed unwilling to move. Then, slowly, almost gracefully, it began to rise. The crowd erupted into cheers, windows rattled, the ground trembled beneath people's feet. The sound was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Many later said they didn't just hear the rocket, they felt it, as Saturn V climbed higher. A trail of brilliant fire stretched across the morning sky. Within minutes, Apollo 11 disappeared into the clouds. The journey had begun. Chapter 2, Leaving Earth. Inside the spacecraft, the astronauts remained focused. The force of the launch pushed them deep into their seats. Every vibration could be felt through the spacecraft, yet years of training had prepared them. After only a few minutes, the first stage had done its job. It separated from the rocket and fell back toward Earth. Moments later, the second stage ignited. Apollo 11 climbed even higher. Soon, the blue sky faded into darkness. Looking through the spacecraft windows, the astronauts watched Earth become smaller with every passing minute. For the first time, home looked like a beautiful blue marble floating alone in space. There were no borders, no countries, no oceans dividing people, only one planet, one home. Hours later, Apollo 11 entered Earth orbit, but the mission wasn't over. Orbiting Earth was only the beginning. The astronauts still had to escape Earth's gravity. Mission Control carefully checked every system. If even one major problem appeared, the mission could be cancelled. After receiving confirmation, the order was given. The powerful third stage ignited. Apollo 11 accelerated to more than 39,000 kilometers per hour. At that incredible speed, the spacecraft finally escaped Earth's gravitational pull. There was no turning back. For the next 4 days, their destination would be the Moon. Chapter 3, For days through the silence of space. Space is often imagined as a place filled with excitement. In reality, it was mostly silent. Outside the spacecraft, there was no sound, no wind, no weather, only endless darkness. Inside, life followed a routine. The astronauts checked instruments, made radio calls to Mission Control, performed navigation checks, photographed Earth and the Moon. ate specially prepared meals, and tried to sleep while floating in zero gravity. Everything seemed peaceful, but danger was never far away. A tiny mechanical failure, a damaged electrical wire, or even a piece of space debris, could end the mission instantly. There were no rescue teams, no emergency hospitals, no way home except the spacecraft itself. Every decision mattered, every system had to keep working. As the hours passed, the Earth grew smaller behind them, the moon grew larger ahead. Soon, it filled the spacecraft windows. For thousands of years, humans had only looked at it from Earth. Now, 3 men were about to see it up close, but reaching the moon was only half the challenge. Landing safely would be far more dangerous, and no one knew exactly what awaited them. One giant leap for mankind. Chapter 4, the most dangerous landing in history, July 20, 1969. After traveling nearly 384,000 kilometers through space, Apollo 11 had finally reached the moon, but the mission was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous part was only beginning. Inside the command module, Michael Collins remained in orbit around the moon. His job was just as important. If something went wrong, he would be the only one capable of bringing the crew home. Meanwhile, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin climbed into a small spacecraft called Eagle. It was fragile, it had no comfortable seats, very little room, and only enough fuel for one attempt. Once the hatch was sealed, they separated from Michael Collins. For the first time since leaving Earth, the crew was split apart. As Eagle slowly descended toward the moon, Mission Control listened to every word. The landing had been practiced hundreds of times on Earth, but no simulation could perfectly prepare them for the real thing. The moon had no atmosphere, no air, no weather, only silence. Then, without warning, an alarm sounded inside the spacecraft. 12:02. Moments later, another alarm. 12:01. The onboard computer was overloaded. For a few tense seconds, nobody knew whether the landing should be aborted. Inside Mission Control, engineers worked furiously. One young computer specialist quickly realized the computer was still functioning. The alarms could be ignored. The message was sent, "You're go for landing." The descent continued, but another problem appeared. Looking through the window, Neil Armstrong realized the computer was guiding Eagle toward a rocky crater filled with massive boulders. Landing there would almost certainly destroy the spacecraft. He made a split-second decision. Taking manual control, he carefully flew Eagle beyond the dangerous rocks. Every second consumed more fuel. Mission Control watched the numbers drop. 60 seconds of fuel remaining. The room fell silent. Then, 30 seconds. There was almost nothing left. Millions of people around the world held their breath. Then, at 2017 Universal Time Coordinated, a calm voice broke the silence. "Houston. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Cheers erupted inside Mission Control. Some engineers wiped away tears. Years of work, countless failures, and unimaginable determination, had brought humanity to another world. Chapter 5, the first footsteps. Even after landing, the astronauts still had work to do. They carefully checked every system, prepared their suits, and depressurized the cabin. Finally, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch. Slowly, he climbed down the ladder, one careful step at a time. Millions of people watched live on television. The images were blurry, black and white, but everyone understood what they were witnessing. At 2:56 Universal Time Coordinated on July 21, Neil Armstrong placed his left boot onto the lunar surface. Then came the words that would echo throughout history: "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." For the first time, a human being stood on another world. Moments later, Buzz Aldrin joined him. Looking around, he described the landscape as magnificent desolation. It was beautiful, but completely lifeless. No trees, no rivers, no wind, only gray dust stretching toward the horizon. Together, the astronauts spent about 2.5 hours outside Eagle. They collected more than 20 kilograms of moon rocks and soil, placed scientific instruments on the surface, took photographs, conducted experiments, and planted the American flag. The flag wasn't meant to claim ownership of the moon. Instead, it represented the nation that had successfully completed the mission. Before returning, Armstrong and Aldrin also left behind a small plaque. It read, "We came in peace for all mankind." those words reminded the world that this achievement belonged to humanity, not just one country. Chapter 6, The Long Journey Home, Back Inside. Eagle, the astronauts rested briefly, then came another critical moment. They had to leave the moon, if the ascent engine failed to start. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin would remain on the moon forever. There would be no rescue mission. Fortunately, the engine ignited exactly as planned. Eagle lifted from the lunar surface, leaving behind its landing platform and the famous footprints. Soon, Armstrong and Aldrin reunited with Michael Collins, who had been patiently orbiting the moon alone. The three astronauts were together once again. Now, only one journey remained: home. 4 days later, on July 24, 1969, Apollo 11 splashed safely into the Pacific Ocean. Navy helicopters quickly reached the capsule. The astronauts were safely recovered, but one final precaution remained. Scientists still didn't know whether microscopic organisms might exist on the moon. Although it seemed unlikely, no chances were taken. The crew spent 21 days in quarantine while doctors carried out careful examinations. In the end, no dangerous organisms were found. The astronauts were finally free to return home. Chapter 7, A Legacy That Still Lives. The success of Apollo 11 transformed history. It proved that humanity could accomplish goals once thought impossible. Children who watched the moon landing grew up to become scientists, engineers, astronauts, and inventors. The mission inspired new technologies that continue to influence our lives today. More Apollo missions followed. Astronauts explored different parts of the moon, conducted more scientific experiments, and brought back hundreds of kilograms of lunar rocks. In 1972, Apollo 17 became the last mission to land humans on the moon. Since then, no person has walked there again. Yet the footprints left by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are still there. Today, untouched, preserved by the moon's airless environment, more than half a century later, countries around the world are preparing to return. The dream that began during the space race continues, not because reaching the moon was the end, but because it proved that impossible dreams can become reality. Ending. On a quiet night, when you look up at the moon, remember this: those tiny footprints are still there, a silent reminder that ordinary people, with extraordinary courage, crossed nearly 384,000 kilometers of space, and forever changed human history. The moon has watched humanity for thousands of years, but in 1969, humanity finally looked back. What do you think was the greatest challenge of the Apollo 11 mission? The launch, the landing, or the journey home? Let me know in the comments.